They came with torches, 30 men, led by a preacher, marching into the pines to kill a woman they'd never dared speak to. They called her a witch, said she cursed their land, stole their children. But when a dying rancher whispered her name with his last breath, he didn't ask for a priest. He sent his only son to find her. And now, that boy stands between fire and mercy, holding a letter soaked in blood. Because the one person they fear may be the only one who can save them all. Before we reveal what Maeve buried beneath the roots of Widow's Bluff, why a preacher's guilt burned hotter than any torch, and how a boy's blood-stained letter cracked a town's silence wide open. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just about survival, they're about conscience standing alone in the fire. Your support keeps these truths from going dark. One click helps carry the ember. Thank you for walking the path they told you to fear. The pines were burning, not from flame but from the light of the mob's torches, orange tongues licking shadows into monstrous shapes along the snow-packed trail. The wind cut sideways, sharp as a blade, but the men barely flinched. They moved with the steadiness of judgment passed long ago, boots crunching over brittle earth as if they walked not to a house but to a sentence. They were not here for words, they were here for fire. Behind them, no one spoke. Whispers had already done their work days, months, years ago. She speaks to animals. She brews storms in her copper pot. She cursed Elias's cattle, 13 dead, one with eyes still open. They had called her a witch the way you name a fever, to banish it. The cabin came into view, a lone sliver of shadow on the rise. No smoke from the chimney. No dog barking. No light in the window. But she was in there. They could feel her, the same way you feel lightning moments before it hits. One man muttered a prayer. Another gripped his torch so tight the wood cracked in his fist. Down in the gully, just out of sight, a teenage boy stumbled against a frozen root and fell to his knees. His breath came in sobs, shallow and ragged, hands shaking as he tried to rise. In one fist, a letter creased and stained, the blood at the corner already black from the cold. He didn't look back, didn't dare. The wind had carried the voices forward. If you see her, don't speak her name, don't look her in the eyes. He had heard it his whole life. From the preacher, from his father, from the school teacher who warned the children to stay out of the trees when fog rolled in too fast. But now his father was dying. Now the old man had taken his son's hand with fingers like broken sticks and rasped one sentence through the blood in his throat. Find her. The boy had run before the last breath left the room. Saddle thrown over a half-dead mare, no coat, no water, just the letter. Just the name scratched on it in a hand that shook. Maeve. The word itself felt dangerous, like saying it might summon something from the deep woods. Yet he said it anyway, again and again, under his breath like a mantra as he pushed uphill. Maeve. 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 His legs burned, his teeth chattered. Still he moved, because behind him, the mob was moving too. The torches climbed higher now, flickering against the snow, and above them all, the cabin sat quiet, unmoving, almost daring them forward. The boy crested the final hill as the first shout rang out. There. He ducked behind a twisted spruce, chest heaving, watching them fan out like wolves. Then he saw her. Just a shape in the doorway, tall, unmoving, the wind lifting her coat like wings. She wasn't hiding, she wasn't afraid. The boy clutched the letter tighter. It felt heavier now, like it might be the weight that tipped the world. The sky over Dry Creek was the color of old ash, stretched thin by the dying light of a sun that hadn't warmed the ground in weeks. Inside the Granger ranch house, all was hushed but for the ragged breath of a man who once commanded cattle drives and men with the same iron in his voice. Now, that voice cracked like frostbitten wood. Caleb sat at his father's bedside, fists clenched in the coarse wool of the blanket, as if holding it tight could keep the old man tethered. His father's face was yellowed parchment, drawn tight over sharp bones. Every breath rattled. Every blink looked heavier than the last. Caleb leaned in, straining to hear, not knowing it would be the last time his father spoke without the weight of blood drowning the words. "Find the woman in the pines." The sentence was barely a whisper, but it hit like a commandment. "She'll know what to do." Caleb pulled back, startled. "You mean the witch?" he asked, instantly ashamed of the word as soon as it left his mouth. But the stories had wrapped around him since he could walk tales of the Pinewoods ghost, the healer who never aged, the woman who lived alone and never came down for church or funerals or harvest dances. His father coughed, then seized Caleb's wrist with a strength that belied the man's failing body. His eyes, glazed and sunken, held no room for doubt. "Maeve," he said. "Not a witch, not what they told you." Then came the blood, bright against cracked lips. Caleb shouted for the doctor, but the man was already in the other room, asleep, useless. That was when the fear sank its teeth into Caleb's spine, not of death, but of what came after if he failed to carry out those words. 3 miles down, in the low belly of town, the wind stirred dust through empty streets. Inside a weather-beaten cabin at the edge of the woods, Maeve lifted a steaming cloth from a boy's forehead. His fever had broken. His breath, once shallow and erratic, now came soft and steady. The child's mother watched from the doorway, arms crossed, not grateful, just suspicious. "You used something unnatural," the woman muttered. Maeve didn't answer. She stood, rinsed the cloth in a basin of chamomile and willow bark, and began to gather her things. The silence stretched. Finally, the woman said, "Thank you." But it sounded more like a challenge. Maeve looked at her. "He'll need water. No meat for a day. Let him sleep." As Maeve stepped outside, the door slammed behind her harder than necessary. 2 men leaned against the fence at the end of the path, hats low over their eyes. One spat in the dirt. "She's lucky the boy made it," one said. "Otherwise we'd be burying 2. Maeve kept walking. She was used to it, the way thanks curdled into accusation the moment fear lifted. The same hands that reached for her when desperation knocked were the first to point when calm returned. She passed the general store, where a pair of women fell silent the moment she came near. A child peeked from behind a barrel and whispered, "That's her." She disappeared into the trees without turning her head. Behind her, the wind rose like breath held too long, and somewhere, a boy was preparing to leave everything he knew to find the one person the world had taught him to fear. Caleb barely remembered collapsing. One moment, he was stumbling up the last slope, legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. The next he was on his knees, the letter clenched so hard in his fist that blood had seeped between his fingers. The world blurred, dark trunks swaying like figures around him, breath catching in broken gasps, and then a shadow moved from the doorway of the cabin, stepping into the lantern glow like it had always belonged to her. He expected menace, expected her to glare, to raise a hand and curse him like the stories said she could. But the woman just stood there, still as the trees. She wore a cloak of thick wool, patched with years of hard use, and her silver-streaked braid hung like a line drawn through time. Her face was neither young nor old, just marked with the quiet knowledge of someone who had seen too much and chosen to endure anyway. Caleb tried to speak. The letter fell from his hand. He awoke hours later under a quilt that smelled of lavender and ash. The room was warm, not cozy, but alive, like something organic had been stitched into the walls. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the beams, some he recognized, most he didn't. Bottles lined the shelves, filled with liquids the colors of moss, honey, and rust. A thick book lay open on the table, its pages marked with drawings of plants, wounds, and symbols. There were maps too weathered and ink-stained, pinned above a desk scattered with tokens. Stones, feathers, a rusted sheriff's badge. His horse was outside, bandaged and limping, but not dead. That alone nearly made Caleb weep. Maeve moved around the room with silent precision, grinding something in a mortar. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he'd come. She already knew. He sat up slowly. His voice, when it came, was rough. "Why'd you help me?" Maeve didn't look at him. "Because your father once didn't listen to the mob." Caleb blinked. "What?" "He gave me water," she said, "when they said I was poison. He didn't believe them. That was enough. It didn't make sense." His whole life, he'd heard the name Maeve spoken like a warning. His father never said it, but now it lived on his lips with reverence. Caleb reached for the letter on the table. She had already read it. He could tell by the way it was folded, careful, not curious. "What do you need from me?" she asked, softly. He swallowed. "He's dying. He said you'd know what to do." Maeve's eyes met his, then green as pine, deep as loam, and for the first time, Caleb felt something shift. Not fear, but weight. She carried the years like armor. And in that moment, he saw not a witch, but a woman who had been standing at the edge of town too long, waiting for someone to remember mercy. She turned back to her tools. "Then we don't have much time." Outside, the wind changed direction. Behind it, something darker followed. The smoke began before the fire, not from burning trees, but from the black tongues of rumor curling through Dry Creek like a sickness no salve could cure. It started with the boy at the livery, who swore he'd seen Caleb Granger ride into the pines. Then the shopkeeper who noticed Maeve's name whispered in trembling tones at the post office. By sundown, the preacher was already standing on the creaking floorboards of the chapel, voice raised not in scripture, but in accusation. "They've let the serpent back into our garden," he roared, fist pounding the pulpit. "The woman who cursed my blood, who took my sister into the woods and never returned her, has lured another child into her trap. Will you stand idle? Or will you reclaim what is holy?" They answered him with shouts, with gun barrels polished and ropes tightened, with fire not yet lit, but promised in every clenched jaw and narrowed eye. The town had waited years for a reason to act. Caleb had given them one. Whether he meant to or not didn't matter. His footprints pointed the way. At the edge of the forest, Maeve stood barefoot in her garden, staring at the empty stillness around her. No birds called, no crickets whispered beneath the roots. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing the tall grasses like a hand afraid of waking something old. She knelt beside her rosemary bush and touched the soil dry, too dry for the season. She looked west, toward the town, though it was hidden by miles of trees. Still, she felt them, moving, gathering. Her fingers dug deeper into the earth, as if feeling for a pulse. Inside the cabin, she lit no lamps. Darkness suited her better when the world prepared for war. She didn't pace, didn't cry, she prepared. Caleb watched her in silence. He had tried to sleep, but the air in the house had shifted tense now, thick with a purpose he didn't yet understand. Maeve moved through the rooms like someone harvesting memory. She pulled down jars and bundles, unfolded scraps of paper inked with diagrams, mixed tinctures that smelled of metal and pine. At one point, she paused beside a shelf and removed a small box wrapped in faded cloth. She opened it, looked inside, then placed it on the center table like it was something sacred. "What is that?" Caleb asked. Maeve didn't answer at first. Then she said, "The truth, when it's ready to be seen." Outside, the night deepened. Far off, an owl called once, then went silent. Caleb stepped to the window and peered out. "Why don't we leave?" She turned, slow and still. "Because they've already decided who I am. If I run, I prove them right." He met her eyes, expecting defiance. But what he saw was older than anger. It was resolve carved into a woman who had survived on the edge of wrath for too long. She reached for her coat and the satchel beside the door. "They're not coming for me," she said. "They're coming for fear dressed in my name." Then she opened the door, and the wind carried with it the scent of smoke, not fire yet, but clothes. The sound came first: hooves against frost-hardened soil, the distant clatter of boots dismounting, and the hiss of torchlight swallowing the early morning fog. Widow's Bluff, a jagged outcrop just east of Maeve's cabin, had long been a place people avoided. The earth there cracked like bone, and the wind never settled. But now it bore witness to a reckoning. Maeve stood at the crest alone, her figure sharp against the milky dawn. She had braided her hair tightly, wrapped her shoulders in her father's old riding cloak, and carried nothing in her hands. No weapons, no charms, just silence. It was the sort of silence that dared men to speak first. Behind her, in the shadows of the cabin, Caleb pressed himself to the edge of the doorway, eyes wide and jaw tight. She had told him to stay inside, but something in him refused. He wouldn't let her face this alone. Not after what she'd done. Not after what he now knew. The posse fanned out in a half-moon along the bluff's edge, faces grim, torches raised. At the center stood Preacher Alden, Bible tucked into the crook of his arm, the cross on his chest swinging with every heavy breath. His voice, when it came, cut through the cold like a scythe. "She's bewitched the boy," he said, gesturing toward Caleb. "Turned him against his blood. Poisoned his mind the same way she's poisoned this town." Caleb took a step forward. "She saved my life." Alden's eyes narrowed. "You don't see it, son. That's what makes it work. It's not fire and brimstone, it's doubt, confusion, sympathy. That's how evil hides." Maeve remained still, gaze steady. The flames flickered in the whites of her eyes, but she didn't blink, she didn't plead. "I've no use for sympathy," she said. "And if confusion's your enemy, then ask yourselves why you're here with fire instead of truth." Murmurs passed between the men. Some shifted their weight. One man lowered his torch slightly. "She lured my sister into the woods," Alden snarled. "She never came back." Maeve's voice dropped low. "Your sister came to me to hide from you. She bore bruises older than her voice. And when she chose not to return, you called that a kidnapping." The preacher's face paled, just for a moment. Then it flushed red with fury. "I'm done with your lies," he said. "We're here to end this. Now." Maeve took one step forward. Just one. It was enough. "If I'm what you say I am," she said, clear and calm, "then strike me down. Burn this place to ash. But if I'm not, if what you've hunted all these years is a reflection of your own fear, then let me show you what it's cost you." Alden hesitated. The fire in his hand wavered. Maeve held his gaze. "Your choice." The wind pulled at the flames, stretching them toward the sky. Somewhere behind the trees, a bird called a hawk, sharp and sudden. And then, silence again. "If your life depended on trusting someone the world hated, would you?" The hush that followed Maeve's challenge was unlike the silence before. This one had weight, an expectancy that pressed on the shoulders of every man standing at Widow's Bluff. Torches crackled, frost bit deeper. And Preacher Alden stood motionless, caught between fire and truth. His jaw clenched. He took a step forward, raising his arm to rally the final command. But before the words could rise from his throat, another voice cut through the air. "Stop." It wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of voice that demanded listening, not through force, but because it broke something sacred in its tone. A figure stepped out from the ring of men older, hunched slightly from years of labor, and carrying something heavier than a rifle slung across his back. Thomas Alden. The preacher's younger brother. A man who'd always been content to stand in the shadow of righteousness, doing his duty quietly. No one had heard him speak in a crowd since their father's funeral. "I can't let this go on," Thomas said, stepping toward the center. "Not anymore." The preacher's face twisted. "Tom, get back." But his brother kept coming. His hands were empty, his eyes were glassy. "You want the truth?" Thomas said. "I'll give it to you." Maeve didn't move. She knew. Caleb could see it in her stillness. She knew what was coming. It wasn't her, Thomas said, voice catching. Your sister Sarah, she wasn't taken. She wasn't lured. She came to Maeve because she was scared of what you would do when you found out. The crowd rippled. Alden froze. Thomas looked at the ground as he spoke, shame soaking every word. She was carrying a child. Said it was someone from the church. Someone married. She went to Maeve, asking for help not to get rid of it, but to keep it safe, quiet. I was the one who found out. I was the one who told her to stay hidden, to never come back. I told her if she returned, you'd tear her apart with scripture. Alden's breath came shallow now, eyes wide. I let the town believe she'd vanished, Thomas continued. I watched you mourn, watched you rage, and I said nothing. Because I thought maybe your fury was better than the truth. Maybe she was safer lost. He turned to Maeve now. But you tried. You kept her fed, warm. You helped her deliver the baby, and when she passed, you buried her under her own name. The world narrowed around the preacher. He swayed slightly, like a man on the edge of a cliff who just realized the ledge was never there. His torch dipped, his mouth opened, closed, opened again. You lied to me, he whispered. Thomas nodded. I did. Alden's gaze shifted to Maeve, 20 years of anger cracking in his eyes like thawing ice. He looked older now, smaller. The fire in his hand dimmed, flickering against the weight of guilt, finally rising to meet him. All around them, the posse had gone quiet. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to listen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath for what would happen next. And Maeve, she said nothing. Not out of triumph, not out of anger, but because some wounds needed no salt to sting. The thaw in the crowd was brief. For a heartbeat, it seemed the truth might carry the day that Thomas's confession, cracked and trembling, had finally loosened the grip of myth on the town's throat. Torches lowered, shoulders sagged. Even Preacher Alden stood stunned, as if he'd glimpsed, for the first time, the wreckage his grief had become. Maeve watched them all with eyes that had seen too many turning points that never turned. But the stillness broke. The rumble came first, hooves, not many, but deliberate, armored in authority. A pair of black-coated men on horseback emerged from the trees, and behind them rode a tall figure wrapped in a dust-cloaked coat and disdain. Judge Malcolm Brant. His boots hit the frozen ground like gavel strikes. Behind him, 4 deputies flanked the bluff like sentries. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked straight at Maeve. I was told there was a public threat here, he said, pulling off his gloves with slow precision. An agitator stirring sedition, evading judgment. No one spoke. The torches sputtered low. Brant turned to Preacher Alden. You made the call, didn't you? Alden nodded weakly, his voice dry. Days ago, before the truth, he meant. Before the lie cracked open. Brant didn't care, his kind never did. He wasn't here for justice, he was here for order. Mob sentiment's not a replacement for legal remedy, he said. But you raise a cry loud enough, and you summon the state. His gaze landed back on Maeve, cold as river stone. You. Step forward. Maeve didn't move. I said step forward. I'm not your subject, she replied calmly. Brant raised a hand. The deputies leveled rifles. Caleb moved then, instinct overriding fear, but Maeve held out her hand. Not yet. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You're not here for the truth, she said. You're here because someone dared to stand outside your reach. Brant smiled without warmth. Truth's a luxury, control isn't. He nodded to his men. Take her. But Maeve stepped back, slow and deliberate, not running, retreating into choice. The crowd didn't help her, not yet. They dropped their stones but hadn't lifted hands in her defense. That middle ground was as dangerous as any verdict. As the deputies advanced, Maeve turned and whispered to Caleb, low and sharp, "Downstairs, cedar box, back of the cellar, bring it." He hesitated. "Now." He ran. She turned back to the deputies, now halfway across the bluff. She didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she stood taller, alone, but not unarmed. Because the one thing stronger than fear was the truth prepared in time. Behind her, the door creaked open. Caleb vanished into the dark below the cabin, feet hitting the steps fast as his pulse. Dust filled his lungs, cobwebs brushing his cheeks. The cellar was colder than above, lined with stone and shadow. He scanned the shelves, roots, jars, bones, and then saw it. A cedar box, worn at the edges, sealed with wax and twine. He grabbed it and turned, heart pounding. Upstairs, the boots were closer. The law had come, but not for justice. It had come to silence. The cellar door banged open, and Caleb stumbled into the pale light. The cedar box clutched tight to his chest. His breath came in ragged bursts, each one clouding in the cold air. Outside, the judge's men had drawn a half-circle around Maeve, rifles raised and eyes hard. The crowd lingered behind them, uncertain now, caught between what they'd heard and what they'd believed their whole lives. The preacher stood in the middle, staring at the ground as if he could dig the truth out of the dirt with his eyes alone. Maeve didn't look at the guns or the judge. She looked only at Caleb. "Open it," she said. Brant sneered. "This isn't a parlor game, woman." Caleb's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. Inside lay a bundle of papers bound with faded ribbon. He pulled the first one free, thin parchment, edges browned with age, inked with the neat, deliberate script of an educated hand. At the top was a name, Sarah Alden, 1873. Caleb turned it toward the crowd, toward the preacher whose lips parted as if the air itself had betrayed him. "These," Maeve said quietly, "are her words, the ones you never let yourself hear." Brant scoffed, but Maeve ignored him. Caleb unfolded the paper, voice quivering as he began to read. The letter was short, written by a woman desperate and afraid, confessing she had fled to Maeve not out of temptation but survival. That she'd feared the child in her belly would damn her, and that the preacher's rage would damn her faster. She'd begged Maeve for secrecy, begged her not to let the town know she'd come. Caleb read every word. No one interrupted, not even Brant. Then came the next letter, a note in a different hand. Thomas Alden's, the brother who'd finally confessed. He'd written of his guilt, of burying his sister quietly in the pines when the fever took her after childbirth, too frightened to tell the truth. Maeve had helped him lay her to rest. She had said no prayers, only words of mercy, because mercy was the only language the dead could still hear. Maeve stepped forward, lifting another paper from the box, a drawing, medical and precise, showing treatments for fever and infection, all in the same script. Beside it lay an official report stamped by the county coroner from 20 years prior, the ink nearly faded. Death by complications of childbirth, no sign of violence. The preacher staggered, gripping the Bible at his side like it might hold him upright. A sob clawed at his throat. Around him, the crowd began to murmur, low and unsteady. One woman covered her mouth and wept. A man spat into the snow, but wouldn't meet Maeve's eyes. The mob had fractured, the neat shape of fury splintered into confusion. Brant's jaw worked, searching for footing. "Forgery," he said, too fast. "Convenient fiction." Thomas stepped forward, his voice rough. "It's her handwriting, Judge. I saw her write those letters. I buried her myself." Silence swallowed the bluff again. The judge shifted his weight, his deputies waiting for his command, but the command didn't come. The power had drained from him the moment the crowd stopped believing it was his to wield. Maeve walked past him without a word and laid the final letter, Sarah's confession, into the preacher's shaking hands. "Truth isn't mercy," she said. "It's the beginning of it." Brant glanced at the faces around him, Faces no longer lit by torchlight, but by something heavier, more dangerous. Understanding. He knew when a mob had turned into a jury, and when a jury had turned into something that no longer obeyed him. He gave a curt nod to his deputies. "Mount up," he said. "We're done here." The horses clattered back into the trees, leaving behind only the sound of wind and breathing. Maeve stood alone again at the bluff's edge, the box open at her feet. The papers fluttered once in the cold breeze before settling back into stillness. The truth had come too late to save what was lost, but just in time to end what should never have begun. The snow melted slow that year, as if the earth itself had decided to take its time reckoning with what had passed. Winter dragged its feet across the valley, but when it finally let go, it did so with a sigh and a promise. The pines stood taller, the river moved freer, and on the ridge where fire had once threatened to erase everything, Maeve began again, not hidden, not hunted, but visible, deliberate. She built the clinic with her own hands, plank by plank, beam by beam, each nail driven without help and without ceremony. It stood just beyond the tree line, close enough for the town to see but far enough that they'd have to choose to walk the path. No signs hung above the door, just a weathered bell and a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. Sometimes people came. More often, they sent their children with letters tucked in coat pockets and baskets of food in trembling hands. No one said thank you, not yet. But they came. Caleb inherited the Granger Ranch at 17. It came to him with rusted hinges and debts coiled like snakes in the ledger, but he took it all the same. He cleared the pastures, mended fences, and found a new rhythm between the rows his father had once plowed with pride. One room in the house remained untouched, except for the books Maeve placed there and the scent of mint she always left behind. She never moved in, but her presence hung in the space like a second heartbeat, silent, steady, necessary. The preacher resigned before spring. He didn't offer a sermon, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply packed his things and walked west one morning, boots scuffing dust where snow had once fallen. Some watched him go from behind curtains. Others turned away. Thomas stood alone in the chapel doorway, hands folded, as his brother passed without a word. The bell never rang again. Maeve didn't speak of it much. She didn't linger on the pain. She didn't gloat. She planted chamomile near the clinic steps and spent her evenings copying notes into a journal. Caleb had built her from old birch bark and stitched leather. He asked her once, during a warm dusk where the sky bled red over the hills, why she still stayed. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Because the story they told about me was louder than the truth, and I want the truth to have roots." He didn't ask again. That summer, a child from town came running barefoot to the clinic, blood on her elbow, tears in her eyes. Her mother followed, too proud to knock, too desperate to leave. Maeve cleaned the wound, bandaged it, and sent the girl home with a sprig of yarrow and a firm warning to watch where she climbed. The mother said nothing, but she didn't pull the child away. That was enough. One evening, as the stars blinked awake over the ridge, Caleb leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, watching the fireflies rise. Maeve stood beside him, older now, but somehow more at ease than he'd ever seen her. The scars were still there in the land, in the people, in her, but they no longer defined the shape of her. She turned to him, voice low. "Let them call you cursed if it keeps them honest." He nodded, because he understood. Because curses, like truths, were just stories waiting to be retold. What if the only person who could save you was the one you tried to burn?